Good morning, fifth grade. So we're going to go ahead and continue with chapter 4, lesson 3, and it's the Colonists Rebel. So we're going to talk a little bit about the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party. So let's go ahead and take a quick look first at the timeline. All right, so let's go ahead and zoom in on that for us. So it says in 1765, Parliament passes the Stamp Act and the Quartering Act. In 1767, Parliament passes the Townshend Acts. In 1772, Samuel Adams forms the first Committee of Correspondence. In 1773, we have Parliament passes the Tea Act. And then in 1774, we have the First Continental Congress meeting. All right, so our essential question for this lesson is what increased tensions between Great Britain and the colonists? So what made them butt heads a little more? What made them a little bit angry at each other? So let's start with the Boston Massacre. It says tensions were high between colonists and the British soldiers in Boston in early 1770. The people of Boston were not happy with the increase in the number of British soldiers in the city. Because of the Quartering Act, some residents were forced to allow British officers to stay in their homes. On March 5th, the conflict turned deadly. Historians debate the specific details, but all accounts begin the same way. A group of colonists gathered at the customs house where taxes on imported goods were paid to Great Britain. British soldiers arrived. In an exchange of angry words and insults quickly turned physical. The colonists hurled snowballs and ice at the soldiers. Some of the soldiers lost control and fired their muskets into the crowd. 5 colonists were killed as a result of these actions. Among them was Crispus Attucks, a man who had escaped from slavery. The incident became known as the Boston Massacre. Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty used the event as fuel to add to the growing movement for colonial self-government. When we think of this term massacre, massacre usually means a large number of people that were murdered or were killed. But in this case, we only had 5 that were actually killed. But the colonists wanted to make this a big deal. So they called it a massacre. So that would really help them create more support for their cause, which is to get self-government, to break away from Great Britain. So this picture here depicts the Boston Massacre. So it's a conflict between the colonists and the British troops, turned deadly in Boston in early 1770. Let's go ahead and take a quick look at the biography here of Samuel Adams and the Committees of Correspondence. So here's a portrait of Samuel Adams. It says Samuel Adams was a key figure in the colonists' quest for freedom. He was among the founders of the Sons of Liberty, a group that was organized to protest the Stamp Act. It continued to speak out against British rule. Anti-British feeling spread slowly throughout the colonies. Adams realized that the colonists needed a way to communicate. Having previously written letters to newspapers to protest the Stamp Act, Adams knew that the fastest and most reliable way to communicate was through letters. In 1772, he formed a 21-person committee to communicate the Patriots' plans and progress. He adapted this idea from a committee that was formed in 1764 to protest new British rules about currency and customs. By forming the committee, Adams and other Sons of Liberty could stay up to date with the events in the colonies. Thus, the Committee of Correspondence was born. Within a few months, more than 80 similar committees of correspondence formed throughout the colonies. A few years later, a volunteer writer from Boston Committee of Correspondence would also make history. His name was Paul Revere. Samuel Adams continued to be an influential figure during the Revolutionary War and in the early Republic. In 1776, he signed the Declaration of Independence. Later, he was elected governor of Massachusetts. During his time in government, he fought for the rights of boys and girls to receive free and equal education. Okay, so as you saw in the video at the opening, we're going to go ahead and continue on with the Boston Tea Party. It says some of the colonists' protests worked. Parliament repealed the Townshend Acts. However, it also passed the Tea Act in 1773. The Tea Act gave the British East India Company the exclusive right to sell tea in the colonies without paying export taxes. This allowed the company to sell its tea at a price cheaper than that of other merchants' tea. Colonial tea merchants could no longer compete. Further, colonists still had to pay taxes when they bought the tea. This upset Samuel Adams, the Sons of Liberty, and other colonists for two reasons. First, it was another tax that they had not voted to approve. And second, it hurt local businesses because it gave a British company a monopoly on tea. In late November of 1773, 3 ships from the East India Company landed in Boston Harbor. Some Boston residents decided to protest the Tea Act by refusing to let the ships unload their cargo. Governor Thomas Hutchinson wanted to honor the new law and decided that the ships were to remain in the harbor until the tea was sold. So this picture here shows angry colonists that threw British tea into Boston Harbor. You can see them throwing the boxes overboard there. This is an example of a tea chest. So it says the Sons of Liberty broke open 342 tea chests. A few weeks later, on the night of December 16th, 1773, the Sons of Liberty took action. About 50 members, some dressed as Mohawk Native Americans, boarded the ships. They broke open the tea chests and dumped the contents of the chests into the harbor. This act of vandalism became known as the Boston Tea Party. Similar protests happened in New York and in Annapolis, Maryland, but only the city of Boston would face immediate consequences. Parliament wanted to punish the colonists for their actions. It closed Boston Harbor until the colonists paid for the tea they had destroyed. It also banned town meetings and sent more soldiers to live in the city. This series of acts was known as the Coercive Acts. The Patriots called them the Intolerable Acts, meaning they were not going to tolerate them, because they found the actions hard to tolerate or live with. Instead of breaking the protesters' spirits, these acts unified the anti-British colonists in their struggle. Representatives from the colonies decided to meet to discuss what to do next. Their meeting would be called the First Continental Congress. So let's go and continue with the First Continental Congress. On September 5th, 1774, representatives from the colonies met in Philadelphia to discuss the coercive acts. Their goal was to plan a response to these laws. 56 men represented 12 of the 13 colonies. Each colony was granted 1 vote. After rejecting a plan to reconcile with the British government, the First Continental Congress decided to write a petition or written request to King George III. In the document, members of the Congress outlined complaints about the way the British government had been treating them. They reminded the king of their status as British citizens. They demanded that they be given the same rights, including the right to representation, that were granted to other British citizens. Then they asked the king to repeal the coercive acts and other laws they felt were unfair to the colonists. Lastly, they proposed an end to trade with Britain until their demands were met. So this here is the building in which the attendees of the First Continental Congress met, and that's Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia. Let's go and look at this primary source here. It says, in their words, the First Continental Congress. The foundation of English liberty and of all free government is a right in the people to participate in their legislative council. And as the English colonists are not represented and from their local and other circumstances cannot properly be represented in the British Parliament, they are entitled to a free and exclusive power of legislation in their several provincial legislatures, where their right of representation can be alone be preserved. In all cases of taxation and internal polity, subject only to the negative of their sovereign, in such manner as has been heretofore used and accustomed. So this was from the Declaration of Rights and Grievances, written on October 14th of 1774. So essentially in that, the colonists are saying, hey, we're still British citizens, and we still have the rights to be able to choose our representatives or have people represent us and talk to us. But they're saying, since we're not in Britain and we're not in close proximity to be able to have that voice in your legislature, in your government, then we should be able to govern over here on our own in the colonies. So here, this is just for you to think about. All right, so it says connections and action. It says back to the essential question. And this was the essential question for the chapter. It says, why would a nation want to become independent? So I want you to think about that. Why would you want to become independent? I want you to take a side, whether you want to be independent or not be independent. So just think about which you would choose. And if you're for independence, which important event convinced you that independence was necessary? And then if you're against independence, think about which events prove that the colonies should remain part of Great Britain. So again, this is just you kind of thinking about these ideas. Now I want you to share your idea with me. So whether you chose independence or against independence, in the short answer box here, I want you to tell me which one you chose and why.